In April of 1841, the spring heat in Colleton County, South Carolina, arrived early and oppressive. The air felt thick, almost chewable, heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and the ever-present rot of the low-country swamps. Rice paddies stretched across the landscape like shallow green mirrors, their flooded fields worked by hundreds of enslaved people who moved through knee-deep water from first light until the last. This was a land of staggering wealth built directly on human suffering, where prosperity was measured not just in acres and bales of rice, but in the number of lives owned and controlled. Cypress Grove Plantation occupied 800 moderately productive acres along the slow-moving Coombe River. Its owner, Silas Rutledge, was a man of ambition far greater than his means. At 54, he was tall and thin, his prematurely gray hair giving him a severe, almost skeletal appearance that matched his temperament. He owned 58 enslaved people, a respectable number by most standards, but barely enough to qualify him for the inner circles of Colleton County's true elite. The wealthiest families controlled thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves. They maintained townhouses in Charleston, sent their children to northern universities, and carried names that opened doors or destroyed reputations with a single whisper. Silas had married Elizabeth Yancey in 1812, a practical union that brought additional land and a respected surname. Elizabeth had been meticulous, more interested in profit margins than social climbing. She died in childbirth in 1813, leaving Silas with a daughter he named Catherine. For 28 years he raised her alone, pouring his energies into climbing the social ladder while keeping his household running with cold efficiency. He was known in business as shrewd but honorable enough, the kind of man who drove hard bargains but kept his word. In private, however, he was consumed by obsession, the need to belong among men who considered themselves untouchable. Catherine Rutledge had grown up isolated on the plantation. Tutors educated her in literature, French, and music, but she never quite belonged anywhere. By 1841, she was 28 years old, weighed nearly 260 pounds, and suffered from what doctors called female hysteria and nervous disorders. Her body had swollen from years of treatments, mercury compounds, laudanum, calomel, and other toxic cures that left her trembling, slurring, and prone to violent fits. The previous year, she had attacked her father with a letter opener during one such episode, leaving a thin white scar across the back of his left hand. White society in Colleton County spoke of her with false sympathy. Poor Silas Rutledge, they murmured at dinners and church socials, burdened with such a mad daughter. What a shame! She was such a pretty child. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew what Catherine had witnessed at the age of 12, or that her so-called madness was not madness at all, but a rational, terrified response to living in a house ruled by monsters. On April 7th, a private courier delivered a letter to Silas's study. The envelope was heavy cream stock, sealed with red wax bearing a symbol he recognized immediately, a scythe crossed with wheat stalks, the mark of the Brethren of the Harvest. The Brethren were 13 men who gathered in secret to perform rituals they believed strengthened the land through blood sacrifice. They blended old European mystery traditions with beliefs borrowed, often violently, from the spiritual practices of enslaved people. At their core, they held that the strong were meant to consume the weak, sometimes literally. Silas had been initiated in 1822. Over the next 19 years, he had attended perhaps 40 gatherings, participating in rites that ranged from disturbing to monstrous. The letter informed him that he was in debt to the group, $12,000 accumulated through years of gambling losses and failed investments. It was an impossible sum. Repayment would require selling most of his land and all his slaves, destroying everything he had built. But the letter offered an alternative, a demonstration of absolute commitment from a member in difficult straits. Silas would publicly place his daughter Catherine under the complete authority of one of his enslaved men, not temporarily, not as punishment, but as a genuine year-long transfer of responsibility. The enslaved man would have total control over her person, her daily activities, her treatment. Silas would announce this at a gathering of the county's prominent families, framing it as an extreme medical measure for Catherine's condition. The humiliation would be absolute. In a society that placed white women on a pedestal of fragile purity and protection, Silas would be declaring his own daughter worth less than his property. But if he complied, his debt would be forgiven, and the brethren would provide financial support to restore his standing. Silas sat alone in his study until the candles burned low. He thought about bankruptcy, about losing Cypress Grove, about becoming a social outcast. He thought about the brethren's reach. Every judge, every lawyer, every politician in the region owed them favors. They could make him disappear if he became inconvenient, or he could sacrifice his daughter's dignity to preserve his own position. It was the choice society had trained him to make: property over people, power over morality. He wrote his acceptance by candlelight and sent it before dawn. 3 days later, another letter arrived, this one containing a name and brief history. Ezekiel Cross, age 33, purchased recently through an intermediary from a Virginia plantation. Skills, carpentry and herbal medicine. Temperament, quiet and obedient. What the letter did not say was that Ezekiel Cross was selected specifically for this purpose. His placement at Cypress Grove was no accident. He carried his own burning need for justice and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment. Ezekiel arrived on April 13th in a wagon driven by a slave trader named Henderson. The wagon pulled directly to the main house, an unusual courtesy, as most transactions occurred near the barns. Silas stepped onto the porch, shading his eyes against the morning sun. In the wagon bed sat Ezekiel. The first thing Silas noticed was his eyes. Most enslaved people kept their gaze lowered as a survival mechanism, but Ezekiel looked directly at Silas, calm and assessing. It made Silas deeply uncomfortable. Ezekiel was tall, perhaps 6'2", with broad shoulders and lean muscle honed by a lifetime of hard labor. His skin bore no whipping scars. His clothes were simple but clean. His hands were large and calloused, yet his fingers moved with a precision that suggested skilled work rather than brute force. Henderson climbed down and handed Silas the papers. Ezekiel Cross, as requested. Previous owner said he was quiet but capable. Your associates want you to know this one was carefully selected. Silas barely glanced at the documents. He addressed Ezekiel directly. You understand why you are here? Yes, sir. Ezekiel's voice was deep, measured, carrying a slight Virginia accent. My daughter is unwell. You will be responsible for her care. Doctors have failed. You claim knowledge of herbal treatments. My grandmother was a healer, sir. She taught me before I was sold. The transaction was completed quickly. Ezekiel was shown to a small cabin near the main house, separate from the other slave quarters. He was given basic supplies and told his sole duty was Catherine's care. Failure would bring severe consequences. Ezekiel nodded and said, "Yes, sir," when required. Then he was left alone. For the first time since arriving, he allowed his expression to change. His jaw unclenched slightly. His shoulders relaxed. He sat on the narrow bed and pulled from inside his shirt a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a worn piece of paper with 3 names written in a child's uncertain handwriting: Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. His wife, his 8-year-old son, his 6-year-old daughter, sold away from him 3 years earlier to a plantation in Alabama known for working people to death. He had learned they all died within 18 months, Sarah from untreated fever, Benjamin from an injury that turned septic, Ruth from simply giving up, a child who stopped eating because she could not understand why her family had been torn apart. And Silas Rutledge had been the one to sell them. Not because he needed the money, not because they had done anything wrong, simply to demonstrate to the brethren that he could make hard decisions without sentimentality. He had split a family like kindling for burning, and he had smiled while doing it.
Ezekiel had spent 2 years working his way south, deliberately getting sold from plantation to plantation, always gathering information. He learned about the brethren through whispers in the quarters. He learned about their rituals, their members, their belief that they were above any consequence. When the opportunity came to be sold specifically to Rutland, Ezekiel knew this was his chance. He would have access to Rutled's house, to his secrets, to his vulnerabilities. And sometimes justice came not from courts or laws, but from patience, planning, and the willingness to become exactly as monstrous as necessary. He folded the paper with the 3 names and tucked it away. Then he lay back on the thin mattress, stared at the ceiling, and began planning what came next. The April 29th public announcement was scheduled for April 29th. 41 people gathered in Cypress Grove's dining room for what the invitations described as an important family announcement. The county's
A middle-aged house slave named Judith, her graying hair pulled into a tight knot, led him up the wide oak staircase to the 2nd floor. She knocked on the heavy door at the end of the hall with visible reluctance. "Miss Catherine," Judith called softly, "your father has brought someone to help with your treatments." From inside came a crash, something heavy striking the wall, followed by Catherine's voice, slurred but sharp with venom. "I do not want more treatments. Send him away." Judith glanced at Ezekiel with sympathy. "She has bad days. This is one." Ezekiel opened the door and stepped inside, closing it behind him before Judith could follow. The room was large but suffocating. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out nearly all light. The air was thick with the stale smell of unwashed bedding, old sweat, and something sweeter and more sinister, the unmistakable metallic rot of mercury poisoning. Books lay scattered across the floor. A shattered porcelain figurine lay in pieces against one wall. Clothes were strewn everywhere. Catherine sat in a high-backed chair beside the cold fireplace, wrapped in a stained dressing gown that had once been fine silk. Her dark hair hung in greasy tangles. Her face was puffy, eyes unfocused, hands trembling continuously on the chair arms. She looked up at him with a mixture of confusion, fear, and anger. "Who are you?" she demanded. "I said no more doctors." "I am not a doctor, miss. My name is Ezekiel. Your father asked me to help you." "Help," she laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "That is what they all say. Help, treatment, medicine. They mean poison. They mean chains. They mean silence." She stood suddenly, swaying dangerously. "I know what this is. He is punishing me again, for remembering, for speaking, for refusing to forget." Ezekiel remained perfectly still, hands loose at his sides, posture non-threatening. "What are you supposed to forget?" The question caught her off guard. Her anger flickered, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath it. "You do not know." "I know nothing, miss, only that your father says you are unwell." Catherine studied him intently, as though truly seeing him for the first time. "You are not from here." "Virginia originally, miss." "Do you know what happens in this house? What they do in the cellar?" Ezekiel's pulse quickened, but his expression remained neutral. "I do not know what you mean." "Liar. There was no heat in it, only exhaustion. Everyone lies. It is easier than truth." She sat heavily again. "Leave me alone. Tell my father his newest torment failed." But Ezekiel moved to the window and drew open the heavy curtains. Sunlight flooded the room. Catherine cried out, covering her eyes as though the light burned. "When did you last go outside, miss?" "I cannot walk that far. I am too weak." "When did you last eat without laudanum making you drowsy?" "The medicine is necessary. The doctors say so." "What if the doctors are wrong?" Her hands slowly came down from her eyes. She stared at him with a mixture of hope and terror. "What did you say?" Ezekiel turned from the window. This was the moment, the first real card played.
I said, what if the doctors are wrong? What if everything you have been told about your condition is designed not to help you, but to keep you controllable? What if your father has been poisoning you for years to ensure you never become well enough to speak about what you saw? Absolute silence. Catherine's eyes went wide, her trembling hands stilled. For 30 long seconds she simply sat there, her mind visibly working. When she spoke again, her voice was different, clearer, sharper. He told you. My father told me nothing, miss, but I have eyes. I know mercury poisoning. I know long-term laudanum use. Healthy women do not become like this without someone working very hard to make them that way. Why would you say this? Suspicion crept back into her tone. This is a trick. You are testing me. I am telling you I can help you become truly well, clear-minded, strong enough to walk out of this room, but it will not be easy. Your body has been dependent on those medicines for years. Stopping will be painful. You will feel worse before you feel better, and your father will not approve. Then why would you do it? Ezekiel met her eyes directly. Because I have my own reasons for wanting Silas Rutledge to suffer, and the best way to make him suffer is to give him back a daughter who is sane enough to remember everything and strong enough to speak about it. The truth hung between them, dangerous, naked, impossible to unsay. But Catherine was damaged, not stupid. She would see through manipulation. Genuine common cause, however, she might believe. You want revenge on my father? Yes, miss. What did he do to you? He sold my family, my wife, my 2 children, sent them to their deaths for no reason except to prove something to people who judge worth by cruelty. Catherine absorbed this. Then she nodded slowly. The brethren, she said, not a question. The brethren, miss. You know of them? She laughed, something manic in the sound. You will learn. Everyone learns eventually. She leaned forward. If I agree, if I let you help me, what happens then? You get well, miss, and when you are well, we decide what to do next. I have my revenge to plan. You have yours. Perhaps they align. Catherine studied him intently for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. I want them all dead. My father, Judge Pelham, Reverend Crenshaw, all of them. Every man who stood in that cellar. I want them to suffer first, to know it is coming, to beg. Then I want them dead. The venom was shocking, not for its intensity, but because it came from someone everyone had dismissed as harmless and mad. This was not madness. This was rage, concentrated by 16 years of suppression. Ezekiel nodded once. Then we have an understanding, Miss Catherine. If we are conspirators, use my name. I cannot, miss, not where anyone might hear. We must be careful. Then know something, Ezekiel. Her eyes glittered dangerously. I have killed before. 3 people, house slaves who might have told my father about my lucid moments. I cannot remember exactly how. The laudanum blurs everything, but I know I did it. They disappeared. Their families were told they ran away. She smiled terribly. So if you plan to betray me, to use me, then dispose of me, know that I am not a victim. I am something worse. Ice ran down Ezekiel's spine. He had expected an ally, not someone whose capacity for violence might exceed his own. But he kept his voice steady. I believe you, miss, and I will not betray you. Good. Catherine stood, more steadily this time. Then let us begin. But I have one condition. When this is over, when we have had our revenge, I want to die. I do not want to live with what I have seen and done. You will help me with that, too. Ezekiel had not expected that, but he was committed now. Agreed. Then we have a deal. She extended her hand. After a brief hesitation, Ezekiel shook it. Her grip was stronger than he had anticipated. Over the following week, Ezekiel began Catherine's treatment in earnest. He gradually reduced her laudanum, replacing some doses with herbal tinctures, valerian root for anxiety and sleep, chamomile for digestive distress, milk thistle to help her liver process the accumulated toxins. He brewed teas from herbs he gathered from the edges of the plantation, things his grandmother had taught him. The withdrawal was brutal. Catherine spent 3 full days in bed with fever, shaking, vomiting, and agonizing cramps. Ezekiel stayed with her through it all, holding a basin when she was sick, wiping her face with cool cloths, speaking quietly just to remind her she was not alone. When the worst passed, she was weak but clearer than she had been in years. The constant tremor in her hands decreased. Her speech was less slurred. She could focus on reading for more than a few minutes at a time. Then the real work began. Ezekiel had her walking short distances at first, from her bed to the door and back. It exhausted her, but he insisted, every day a little further. He adjusted her diet, bringing lean meats, vegetables, and broth instead of the heavy pastries and rich foods she had used as comfort. He limited portions strictly, though she fought him. Years of using pain to numb pain felt like punishment. While working on her physical recovery, they talked. Catherine told him about the cellar, about what she had seen at 12 years old. She described it in detail that made Ezekiel's stomach turn, but he listened without interruption. She told him about the years of gaslighting that followed, her father convincing everyone, including herself, that she was mad, that she had invented memories, that nothing she said could be trusted. She told him about the journal she kept hidden, pages documenting dates and times when her father left late at night, names of visitors at strange hours, sounds from below that should not be possible. Ezekiel told her about his family, about Sarah, who sang hymns while working in the fields and taught her children to read in secret despite the danger, about Benjamin, who at 8 could do mathematics that amazed overseers.
The 2 weeks leading up to May 14th passed in deceptive calm. Catherine continued her recovery with steady determination. Her weight dropped noticeably as the last traces of mercury and laudanum left her system. Her mind remained sharp, her movements grew more confident. She could now walk the full length of the upstairs hallway and down the grand staircase without assistance. Every day brought small victories. Reading for hours without fatigue, speaking without slurring, eating meals without the old compulsion to overindulge. But the real progress happened in the quiet hours after dark. Catherine translated more sections of her coded journals for Ezekiel, filling in horrifying details about the brethren of the harvest. She described their network, secret societies in every major southern city, all connected by blood oaths and shared guilt. She spoke of rituals timed to planting and harvest cycles, of victims selected for their vulnerability, of bodies disposed of in the swamps where alligators and time erased all evidence. Ezekiel listened without interruption, committing every name and date to memory. At night, alone in his cabin, he stared at the ceiling and repeated the details like a litany. He was building a map in his mind, not just of the cellar, but of the men who had destroyed his family and so many others. May 14th dawned clear and hot. Silas departed for Charleston at first light, his carriage rolling down the long oak-lined drive. He took his personal manservant and 2 trunks of papers. He told the household he would return the evening of May 16th. That gave Catherine and Ezekiel almost 3 full days and 2 nights to act. They waited until full darkness on the 14th. The house settled into its evening routine, slaves retiring to the quarters, overseers making their final rounds, lamps extinguished one by one. By 10 o'clock, the main house was silent, except for the creak of settling timbers and the distant chorus of frogs from the river. They met in Catherine's room. She had changed into simple dark clothing, a plain cotton dress with no petticoats, hair pulled back tightly. She looked like someone preparing for battle. "Are you certain, miss?" Ezekiel asked quietly. "I have never been more certain. Let us go." The cellar entrance was hidden behind a false panel in the kitchen pantry.
Catherine pressed a particular knot in the wood. A soft click sounded, and the panel swung inward to reveal narrow wooden stairs descending into blackness. The smell hit them immediately. Damp earth, old smoke, and something organic and rotten that made Ezekiel's stomach turn. Catherine noticed his reaction. "You get used to it," she whispered. "I wish I could say you stop smelling it, but I would be lying." They descended carefully. Ezekiel carried a shuttered lantern, providing only the thinnest sliver of light. The stairs were steep and worn smooth by years of use. The wood creaked under their weight. After 20 steps, they reached the bottom. The main cellar was larger than Ezekiel had imagined, easily 30 feet square, with low ceilings supported by thick oak beams. The floor was packed earth, the walls lined with damp stone. In the center stood what Catherine had called the altar, a heavy wooden table, its surface stained dark, grooves carved along the edges to channel liquid. Around the room were iron candle holders, sealed clay jars, wooden boxes, and a rack holding black robes trimmed in crimson. Along one wall stood shelves containing books and papers. Catherine moved with the certainty of someone following a memorized map. She led Ezekiel to the far wall where the stones appeared solid. She pressed a particular stone, another soft click, and a section of wall swung inward to reveal a smaller chamber. This inner room was only about 10 feet square. In the center, on a wooden stand, sat the ledger, a massive volume 2 feet tall and 18 inches wide, bound in dark leather with metal clasps. Next to it were smaller journals. Along the walls were shelves containing jars Ezekiel refused to examine too closely. Some held pale floating shapes that he did not want to identify. "There," Ezekiel whispered, pointing. "That is what we need." Ezekiel moved to the stand and opened the book carefully. The pages were thick parchment covered with meticulous handwriting. Entries stretched back to 1800. Names, dates, descriptions written in clinical detail, as though documenting scientific experiments rather than atrocities. He began to read, and with each page his horror deepened. These men had not committed occasional violence, they had made it systematic. Regular gatherings every 6 weeks, rituals timed to agricultural cycles, believing the blood fed the land. They had killed at least 37 people over the years, probably more, mostly enslaved people, but also poor whites, indigenous wanderers, anyone vulnerable. And the notes about consumption were explicit, pieces of victims prepared in specific ways, consumed during ritualistic meals they believed transferred power. "Dear God," Ezekiel whispered. "I tried to tell you," Catherine said flatly. "I watched them when I was 12. I watched them cut pieces from that woman on the altar. I watched my father raise a goblet and drink. Then I spent 16 years being told I was insane, that I imagined it all. But I knew. I always knew." Ezekiel turned pages, searching for entries about his family. He found them in October 1838. 3 brief lines. "Purchased family unit from Virginia. Woman, Sarah. Children, Benjamin and Ruth. Separated from male to demonstrate resolve. Sent to Alabama contact. Payment received." 3 lines. That was all his family's destruction had merited. "We need to take this," Ezekiel said, voice tight with rage. "No," Catherine said, placing her hand on his arm. "If we take it now, they will know immediately. We need to copy the most important entries first." She was right. Revenge required patience. They had to be smarter than their enemies. They spent the next 3 hours working by the dim lantern light. Catherine had brought paper, ink, and quills. She copied entries about specific rituals, focusing on ones naming current members. Ezekiel documented victims, creating a list of names and dates that could potentially be cross-referenced with other records. The work was exhausting and soul-crushing. Several times Ezekiel had to stop, hands shaking too badly to hold the pen. Once Catherine left the chamber entirely, overcome with memories, retching in the outer room. But slowly, methodically, they built their case, page after page of evidence. They were so focused that neither heard the footsteps on the cellar stairs. The first indication something was wrong was when brighter lantern light flared in the outer chamber. Ezekiel looked up sharply, blood going cold. Silas Rutledge stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 other men. Behind them, at least 4 more figures waited in the main cellar. "I must admit, I am impressed. I did not think you would find the inner chamber." Catherine stood slowly, placing herself between her father and Ezekiel. "You were supposed to be in Charleston." "I was supposed to be, but I never trusted your miraculous recovery, so I made arrangements. I left this morning, yes, but I returned this afternoon and watched the house all evening, waiting to see what you would do." He stepped into the small chamber. The 2 men blocked the exit. "Did you really think I would not anticipate this, that I would not prepare for the possibility you might remember, might seek revenge? You have been poisoning me for 16 years, and you expect me to simply accept that? I expect you to understand it. It was necessary. You saw something you shouldn't have seen as a child. You could not understand. I could not allow you to destroy everything. I was 12, and I watched you murder a woman and eat her flesh. That was not insanity, Father. That was a reasonable response to witnessing evil." "Evil?" Silas echoed. "Such a simple word." He moved further into the room, his eyes shifting between Catherine and Ezekiel. "And you," he said to Ezekiel, "using my daughter to get to me, filling her head with ideas of revenge?" Ezekiel said nothing, calculating distances and odds. 7 men against 1, with Catherine in no condition to fight. The situation looked hopeless. Silas seemed to read his thoughts. "Do not do anything foolish. I do not want to hurt you either, not permanently, but I cannot have this rebellion continuing." He gestured to the men behind him. "Bring them upstairs. We need to discuss what happens next." They were taken to Silas's study and locked inside together. The room was windowless except for one high transom, impossible to reach. The door was heavy oak, locked from the outside. As soon as they were alone, Catherine moved to Ezekiel. "Were you hurt?" "No, miss, but we are in serious trouble." "Yes, but not as much as you think." She pulled something from inside her dress, the papers they had been copying. "I managed to keep these. He did not search me, too confident." "That will not help if we are dead. We are not going to die tonight."
The 3 weeks that followed Catherine's departure were the longest and most agonizing of Ezekiel's life. He was kept under constant surveillance. 2 overseers shadowed him everywhere he went, when he carried firewood, when he repaired fence posts, when he walked the short distance from his cabin to the main house. He was forbidden to leave the plantation grounds. His days were filled with menial, meaningless tasks designed to keep him occupied and visible. Scrubbing floors, mending harnesses, hauling water, anything to prevent him from having time alone to plan or escape. But the brethren also gave him access to places they would never have allowed before. He was permitted inside the main house to perform chores in the study, the library, even the cellar when supplies needed moving. They were watching him, yes, but they were also testing him, seeing if he would attempt sabotage, seeing if he would try to flee, seeing if his supposed acceptance of their offer was genuine. Ezekiel played the part of a defeated man who had made a pragmatic choice for survival. He was quiet, obedient, asked no questions, caused no problems. He kept his eyes downcast when the overseers were near. He answered yes, sir, and no, sir, without hesitation. But every moment he was observing, learning the routines of the house, noting which slaves could be trusted with small secrets, which overseers were lazy or cruel, which brethren members visited regularly and when. He was building a mental map of every weakness, every vulnerability. At night, alone in his cabin, he thought about what was coming. His initiation would require participation in their rituals. They would demand he commit an act so heinous that he could never expose them without destroying himself. He thought about how far he was willing to go, what lines he would not cross, even for revenge, whether there was any act so terrible that justice did not justify it. He did not have good answers. On the night of June 2nd, just after midnight, a soft knock came at his cabin door. Ezekiel opened it to find Silas Rutledge standing there alone, holding a lantern. "May I come in?" Silas asked. Ezekiel stepped aside without a word. Silas entered and looked around the sparse room, the narrow bed, the single chair, the small table. He set the lantern down and sat uninvited. "Tomorrow night," Silas said, "you will become one of us, not fully, never fully, but enough. I want you to understand what that means." "I understand what I agreed to." "Do you, truly?" Silas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "The Brethren has existed for 43 years. In that time we have never lost a member to exposure, never had someone break our code of silence. Do you know why? Because everyone is equally guilty, but also because we take care of each other. A man joins the Brethren and suddenly doors open, business opportunities appear, legal problems disappear, enemies find themselves in difficulty. We are not just a society, Ezekiel. We are a network of power that extends across the entire South. And in exchange, I help you murder people." Silas did not flinch. "In exchange, you help us maintain the natural order, the strong over the weak, the powerful over the powerless. That is how the world has always worked. We simply acknowledge it and use it to our advantage. You killed my family to demonstrate your commitment to that order." "I did," Silas said evenly, "and I would do it again. Sentiment is weakness. Love is weakness. The moment you allow yourself to care more about individuals than about power, you have already lost." Silas leaned closer. "But here is why I want you to understand. Your family is dead. Nothing you do will change that, but you can ensure their deaths meant something. You can use the power the Brethren offers to prevent other families from suffering the same fate. You can work from inside our organization to make changes, to push for less brutal treatment of slaves, to advocate for better conditions for slaves. You will have a voice at our table that is worth something." It was almost convincing. Almost. The idea that Ezekiel could become some kind of reformer from within, using his position to help others. But he knew it was a trap, a rationalization designed to ease the consciences of men who had long since abandoned theirs. "Why are you telling me this?" Ezekiel asked. "Because I want you to succeed, because having you as an ally is more valuable than having you as an enemy, because I killed your family, but I do not want to kill you." Silas stood. "Tomorrow night you will be asked to do something difficult, something that will test whether you truly commit to this path. I am telling you now, whatever you are asked to do it. Do not hesitate, do not show weakness, because if you fail the test, both you and Catherine die." Ezekiel's blood turned to ice. Silas smiled thinly. "Yes, I know she is not really in Philadelphia. I know she is hiding somewhere, planning her own revenge. But I have people watching for her. The moment she surfaces, if you have not proven yourself, she will be found and killed. Do you understand?" "I understand," Ezekiel said quietly. Silas nodded once and left without another word. Ezekiel sat alone in the dark cabin, the lantern's flame flickering on the wall. He pulled out the worn paper with his family's names and looked at them in the moonlight coming through the small window. "Forgive me," he whispered, "for what I'm about to do, for what I have to become. I promise you it will be for nothing." The gathering began at midnight on June 3rd. Ezekiel was brought to the cellar by 2 Brethren members. They stripped him to the waist and tied his hands behind his back with rough hemp rope. They led him down the narrow stairs into the candlelit chamber where all 13 members waited in their black and crimson robes. Silas stood at the head of the altar. "Brothers of the harvest, tonight we conduct an initiation unlike any in our history.
We bring into our circle a man who has every reason to hate us, a man who has lost everything because of what we represent. We do this to prove that our power extends even to our enemies, that anyone can be brought into the fold if the price is right." He gestured. 2 more members brought forward a bound and gagged figure, struggling weakly. They placed the person on the altar and stepped back. It was a young woman, enslaved, perhaps 18 or 19 years old. Her eyes were wide with terror above the gag. She was trembling, tears streaming down her face. "This is your test, Ezekiel," Silas said. "To join us, you must participate in our ritual. You must take the knife and make the first cut. You must prove that your desire for revenge against Gaines is stronger than your moral objections to our methods. If you refuse, you die here tonight. If you accept, you become one of us, and we help you destroy the man who killed your family." The members began chanting, low, rhythmic sounds in a language Ezekiel did not recognize. The candles flickered, shadows danced on the stone walls. Silas held out a long knife, its blade wickedly sharp, handle wrapped in dark leather. "Take it, make the choice." Ezekiel looked at the woman on the altar. She was crying, trying to scream through the gag. Her eyes found his, and in them he saw every enslaved person who had ever suffered at the hands of men like the Brethren. He saw Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. He saw himself. He looked at the knife, at Silas, at the 13 men watching to see what he would do. This was the moment, the point where he would either become a monster or die resisting. But there was a third option, one he had been planning for 3 weeks, one that required perfect timing and absolute commitment. He stepped forward and took the knife. The Brethren members nodded approvingly. Silas smiled. The chanting increased in intensity. Ezekiel raised the knife, and then he moved, not towards the woman, towards the nearest Brethren member to his left. The knife flashed in the candlelight and buried itself in the man's throat before anyone could react. Blood sprayed across the altar. The man collapsed, gurgling. Ezekiel grabbed the fallen member's robe, yanking it free in one violent motion. He threw it over the nearest cluster of candles, plunging half the room into sudden darkness. Chaos erupted. He moved through the confusion like violence incarnate, years of rage focused into lethal precision. He grabbed another man, using him as a shield as someone swung at him with a ceremonial dagger. He threw the body into 2 more Brethren, tangling them. He kicked out at a knee, heard bone crack. He snatched a heavy iron candle holder and smashed it into a face, feeling the crunch of cartilage. The Brethren were powerful men, but they were not fighters. They were soft, privileged, accustomed to others doing violence for them. Ezekiel was none of those things. He fought his way towards the altar, grabbed the young woman, and slit through her bonds with the knife he had somehow kept hold of. "Run!" he shouted, shoving her towards the stairs. "Run!" She scrambled off the altar and fled upward, bare feet slapping against the wooden steps. Ezekiel turned back to face the remaining Brethren, still 7 of them standing, blocking the stairs. "You have made a terrible mistake," Silas said, voice steady despite the carnage. "You have killed yourself and Catherine, both." "Maybe," Ezekiel replied, blood dripping from the knife, "but I will take as many of you with me as I can." What he did not know, what none of the Brethren knew, was that above them, in the main house, Catherine had returned. She had never gone to Philadelphia. For 3 weeks she had hidden in the slave quarters, moved.
The cellar reeked of blood, smoke, and fear. Bodies lay scattered across the packed earth floor. 13 men who had once believed themselves invincible, now reduced to lifeless forms and torn robes. The crimson cloth on the altar was soaked dark. Candle flames still flickered in their iron holders, casting long, unsteady shadows over the carnage. Catherine stood in the center of it all, chest heaving, hands trembling not from terror, but from the sudden, overwhelming release of 16 years of suppressed rage. Ezekiel moved to her side, the knife still in his hand, blood drying on his skin and chest. "Are you hurt?" he asked again, voice low. "No," she said. "Are you?" "Minor cuts, nothing serious." He looked around at the slaughter, the broken bodies, the overturned chairs, the blood pooling in the grooves of the altar. "We cannot leave any of this," he said. "If anyone finds proof, they will hunt us to the ends of the earth." Catherine nodded. Her eyes were clear, focused. The haze of years of poisoning had lifted entirely, leaving behind a mind as sharp and cold as steel. "Now we burn it all," she said. "The cellar, the ledger, the evidence. We destroy every trace of what happened here. We make it look like an accident, a terrible, tragic accident." They worked quickly and methodically. Catherine knew where Silas kept barrels of lamp oil in the main house for the winter months. Ezekiel and two of the strongest men from the group carried them down the stairs, pouring the oil over the wooden beams, the altar, the shelves of jars, the stacks of robes. They dragged the bodies into positions that might suggest they had been overcome by smoke before they could escape. Silas near the foot of the stairs, as though he had tried to lead the way out. Judge Pelham slumped against the wall. Reverend Crenshaw sprawled near the altar as if in prayer. The massive ledger remained on its stand in the hidden chamber. Catherine opened it one last time and carefully tore out the 3 pages that mentioned Ezekiel's family, Sarah, Benjamin, and Ruth. She folded them and handed them to him. "For them," she said, "so they are not forgotten." Ezekiel tucked the pages inside his shirt, against his heart. Then Catherine placed the ledger back on the stand. Ezekiel arranged kindling and broken furniture around it, soaking everything in oil. They poured the last of the barrels over the wooden stairs and the ceiling beams. Before they lit the fire, Catherine paused. "Wait," she said. She moved to the shelves and gathered the smaller journals, the personal records of individual members. She added them to the pile on the altar. Everything, every name, every date, every confession. Ezekiel nodded. They stepped back into the main chamber. Catherine took a candle from its holder and held it to the oil-soaked wood at the base of the stairs. The flame caught immediately, racing upward in a hungry orange line. Within seconds, the fire roared to life. Heat blasted through the cellar. Smoke billowed thick and black. The flames licked the beams, the altar, the ledger. Parchment curled and blackened, leather cracked and split. Catherine and Ezekiel fled up the stairs just as the first ceiling joist cracked overhead. They burst out into the kitchen, slamming the hidden panel shut behind them. Already smoke was seeping through the cracks. Outside, the night air was cool and sweet after the stench of the cellar. The group of 23 enslaved people who had helped them stood in a loose circle in the yard, faces illuminated by the growing glow from the windows. Catherine addressed them quietly. "Go back to your quarters. Say nothing, see nothing, know nothing. When the fire is discovered, you were asleep. You woke to smoke. You tried to save the master, but could not reach him. That is all." They nodded, understanding perfectly. Survival had taught them silence long ago. One by one they melted away into the darkness, returning to their cabins, to the fields, to the lives they had endured for so long. Catherine and Ezekiel stood together in the yard, watching as flames began to lick the upper windows of the main house. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Old dry timber, oil-soaked floors, heavy drapes feeding the blaze. Within an hour, Cypress Grove Plantation was fully engulfed. The roar of the fire drowned out every other sound. Sparks spiraled into the night sky like fireflies. The heat was so intense that the live oaks surrounding the house began to smolder. People would come soon. Overseers from neighboring plantations would see the glow. Riders would be sent. Questions would be asked. But Catherine and Ezekiel had their story ready. A tragic accident. A candle knocked over in the cellar during a late-night meeting. The master and his guests trapped below. Smoke too thick to escape. A tragic, unavoidable accident.
As the sun rose over the burning ruins, Catherine turned to Ezekiel. "What will you do now?" "Go north," he said. "Use the chaos of this fire to disappear, maybe find others who want to fight, create a network that can help people escape." He pulled out the folded pages from his shirt and looked at them for a long moment. "I cannot bring them back," he said quietly, "but I can make sure others do not suffer the same fate." Catherine nodded. "I will go north as well, use the money I have been stealing from my father's accounts for years, start over, but I will not forget. I will document everything that happened here. I will write it all down so that someday, somehow, someone knows the truth. They will seal your testimony too if you try to make it public. Then I will hide it, I will code it, I will leave it somewhere to be found decades from now, when we are all dead and it cannot hurt us anymore." She looked at the burning house, flames now leaping from the roof. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even when people try to bury it. They stayed until the fire burned itself out, until Cypress Grove was nothing but ash and blackened timbers, until there was nothing left to show that 13 men had gathered there to commit atrocities. Then they walked away in opposite directions. Catherine headed north towards Charleston, where she could disappear into the crowds and eventually make her way to Philadelphia or farther. Ezekiel turned west towards the frontier, places where enslaved people could vanish into communities that asked no questions, where he could begin the slow work of building something new. They never saw each other again. The official story was exactly as they had planned, a tragic accident. Silas Rutledge and 12 prominent gentlemen had gathered at Cypress Grove to discuss business when a fire broke out in the cellar. All 13 perished, overcome by smoke before they could escape, a terrible loss for Colleton County. Funerals were held with full honors. Eulogies praised their contributions to society, their generosity, their leadership, their devotion to the land. Catherine Rutledge was reported to have died in the fire as well, her father's mad daughter trapped in her room, unable to escape. A particularly sad footnote to an already tragic event. No one questioned it. No one looked too closely. The enslaved people who had participated said nothing. They had no reason to speak, and every reason to remain silent. Most were sold within months as Cypress Grove was liquidated. They scattered across South Carolina and beyond, carrying their secret to their graves. Years passed. The ruins of Cypress Grove were eventually demolished. The land was sold, new buildings constructed. Life moved on as it always does, covering over the past with the present. But whispers persisted. Stories told in slave quarters late at night about the plantation where the masters burned, about the night justice came to men who thought themselves untouchable, about the woman and the man who made it happen. The stories changed with each telling, becoming legend, becoming myth, but the core remained, that cruelty had consequences, that power was not absolute, that powerless found their power sometimes. In 1863, during the Civil War, Union troops occupied the area where Cypress Grove had stood. They found evidence of old tunnels beneath the property, bones in the nearby swamp, markings on trees that suggested ritual sites. But the war moved on, and no one had time to investigate further. In 1971, during demolition work on a new house built on the old site, a journal was found sealed inside a wall. It detailed everything: names, dates, rituals, victims. But as Catherine had predicted, it was coded, and before anyone could fully decode it, the journal vanished from county records. Some say it was destroyed. Others say it was taken by descendants of the Brethren families, protecting their ancestors' secrets. A few believe it still exists somewhere, waiting to be rediscovered when the time is right. What is known is this: 13 prominent men died in a fire in 1841. Catherine Rutledge disappeared shortly afterward, though no body was ever confirmed found. An enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross was reported sold to a plantation in Alabama, but no record of the transaction exists. And for years afterward,